Some months ago, I participated to the GMTK Jam where I created within a team the game powered by geometry. In it, I implemented a dynamic soundtrack that evolves during the level and changes according to players' action. Composing it took me 2/3 of the afternoon, and implementing it a bit less than an hour. If that seems short, that's first because it's not the first time I implement such a thing, but also because with experience I acquired several tricks that make these things easier to do. The music logic in Powered by Geometry is actually not that complicated, but it's enough to give the feeling of an orchestra that reacts to the game. So today I want to share with you some of these tricks, because sound in a video game is important and an adaptive music can really make the difference and immerse players in your experience. And I can also tell you that it makes a good impression in a game jam. For this, you won't need to learn complex tools like voice or advanced audio manipulation. These tips require only a small bunch of code and can work in any framework. The first one is one you might already know: vertical layering. Vertical layering consists in separating your music into several tracks, each one corresponding to one or several instruments, and playing them all together. You can then enable or disable some specific tracks to add some effect to your music or make it evolve. For example, you can add drums when the player enters a fighting area, or you can add instrument one by one as the player progresses in the level, or you can even replace all of them to drastically change the mood in the same track. As I said, it's not really rocket science. All you need is several players that play together, having all their volume to 0 by default, except the one you need at the start. When you want to change the mood, you just have to increase their volume to activate them, or drop them to 0 to deactivate them. To make the change progressive, you can simply use twins. I recommend to use duration around 1 second, with ease in and out. So that's the theoretical basis, and it already allows you to create neat things. But if you just start all your players at the same time and let them loop, you'll likely encounter an issue. After a while, you'll notice they're not synchronized anymore. Even if your audio files share the same rhythm and the exact same length, there will always be some very small delay when they loop. And even if you can't hear them at first, if you let them play for too long, they end up offset. This is what dynamic music tools are for, among other things. They keep the rhythm in place to make sure that all the tracks play together. But I promise you that you won't have to use them, so here is a little technique that allows you to get around this problem. Arrhythmic tracks. No more sync issues if there's no rhythm, right? It's what I did in Powered by Geometry. Every layers are sustained notes or chords or fast arpeggios. They can get offset, but it's not dramatic because it won't be noticed. There's no percussion and they all play on the same chord. But this is an ambient song. Maybe you want to play other things. And it's still feasible. You just have to have one main track that includes melodies and drums, and several secondary dynamic tracks that are independent from the rhythms. It can be strings or ambient noises, chords or fast succession of notes. There are actually many ways you can create melodic accompaniment that can get slightly offset without it being noticed. It will still work because if you enable or disable them at the right time, it will have strong link with what's happening in the game. This way you'll have a richer composition than if these tracks were playing at a fixed time. However, for this to work well, you'll need tracks that seamlessly loop. And for this, you need two capital elements. First one is loop transitions. Your audio files don't last forever, it's likely tracks that play in loop. But you can't loop them at any random time, it needs to feel continuous, as if it was a prolongation of the song. If the player notices when the loop occurs, it kinda breaks the rhythm. So for it to work, composition-wise, your loops need to follow one another in a pleasant way. And for that, a trick that I frequently use is to create a bridge between the end of a loop and the beginning of the next one. Take this very basic melody. It sounds repetitive. You can clearly hear when it stops to then restart from the top. That's because our melody ends on a conclusive note. It closes everything and don't allow the song to continue. But by adding a single note, okay, it's still repetitive, not gonna lie, but there's already a bit more groove. The end of the loop introduces the start of the next one, keeping some kind of flow that makes it sound natural. Let's take another example on a longer track. You can hear that the end of the loop makes you want for the music to continue. There's a tension that needs to be resolved, which allows to enter another verse. It's that kind of tension and unresolved notes that you need to add at the end of your loops. Although it's not mandatory, you can very well make a great loop without it, but it's a simple technique that helps finding interesting melodies. Alright, but we're talking composition here. Let's get back to more technical subjects. There's something else that you need to properly loop, it's joints. There's a thing that you must absolutely avoid for your loops, pokes. What are pokes? Well, listen to this track and pay attention to the moment where it loops. You heard that? Unpleasant, right? Well, that's a poke. It happens because we have an instrument with a long decay on top of reverb, and when the track restarts from zero, it abruptly cuts the sound. If you use a music management tool, it will loop in a smarter way by juxtaposing the tracks like so. But that's already more tricky to implement by yourself. The easiest way to have a music that repeats remains to activate the loop option in your favorite engine. So for the loop to play without flow, there's a sneaky trick. Export your music file entirely with silence at the end. Cut on the last beat where it should loop, and move the remaining at the start of the file on a new track. This way, when it will repeat, we'll hear the end of the previous note playing alongside the beginning. The counterpart is that the first time you play the track, you will hear an echo of the end, which sounds a bit strange. If it's one of the dynamic track, it's not a problem because it will start at volume 0 anyway. But for your main track, what you can do is start it with a fade-in. You'll have to balance it according to how much we hear the ending's resonance and if it's really bothering. Sometimes a fade-in of a few milliseconds can be enough. That's kind of a brutal solution, but it do wonders. You'll also have similar troubles for sustained tracks. If you export a sustained note from a music software, it will likely look like this. If you want to make it loop by cutting the beginning and the end, so that it plays continuously, there are chances that it won't fit at all. So how to solve that? Well, we can manage that a bit in the same way than earlier, except that here, we'll cut in the middle, then put the right part on the left, and the left part on the right. That way we know that the two hands will fit with each other and will form a continuous sound. Then for the middle, we can patch the pieces together with a fading. If the instrument already has fading on its attack and decay, you might not need to change anything. Otherwise, it's easy to make one by hand. My advice is to make long enough fadings and to place the fade-in a bit earlier to make sure there is sound when we start the fade-out. It requires a bit of practice, but with time you kinda get the intuition to make smooth fading. The goal is to make the transition mostly unnoticeable. Once you did that, you obtain a sound that can play indefinitely without interruption. With all this, you should now have good basis to quickly implement dynamic music. But there's a last trick I want to give you in order to make your sound design a bit more juicy. Let's go further than adaptive music and venture into the field of generative music. On top of a music background, your game probably needs SFX. What if the sounds were also part of the music? There's a lot of small actions that you can harmonize. When the player picks up a coin, when they level up, when enemies are spawning, when a goal is achieved, all of these are audio feedbacks that you can include in your music. And it's not that complicated to do. Find a chord that you can play at any time, or a sequence of notes that always sounds nice no matter the bar, and from there, with the adequate instruments, you just have to export it and play it on a separate player. And with that, more than a SFX, you have a sound that is part of your song. It works even with individual notes. If one of your sounds is played frequently, rather than always using the same noise, create your own instrument and play random notes. You just have to select 4 or 5 that are in tune with the music, and it works. It creates a completely procedural melody that reacts to players' actions. To make this kind of instrument, you can just use several small audio files, or if you're on Godot, I've made a plugin to handle virtual instruments just for that purpose. What's nice with this method is that you don't necessarily have to play on the rhythm. If your jingles are short enough, what matters is not to be synchronized to the music, but to the gameplay. Feedbacks produced this way are generally very satisfying to hear. To illustrate the idea a bit, here is a game I created using this technique. Here you have a very short background loop, but catching drops create a new melody that gives the music consistency. And when you go to the next level, there's a piano sound to make a pleasant transition. In this other game, I chose not to have any background music, but only several little jingles inspired by Wii Sports, and SFX that play only 3 notes. With all these methods, you should have enough tools to create simple music systems with which the player can interact to make their experience even more pleasant. You won't just have a background music, but a real accompaniment that emphasizes everything that's happening in your game. Those are simple tricks that give you some basics and that you can use even in Game Jam. But you'll also quickly see their limits. If you want to go further, then you'll need dedicated tools. And some of them are actually not too hard to learn. On Godot, you have the plugin Godot Meta Players, which is quite easy to manage, or since 4.3, you can even use the native components Audio Stream Synchronize and Audio Stream Interactive. On Unity, I haven't found any small tool that can be used on the fly, but you can try out Fmode, it's still not too complex. And finally, if you're developing on the web, I've made the library Orchestro.js that allows to easily manage audio tracks. As for Unreal, to be honest, I don't know that engine at all. I know they have meta sounds, but I can't say if they are easy to use or not. I guess you can also uninstall Unreal and use Godot instead. If you ask me, that's the easier solution. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful, whether you're a musician, sound designer or developer. I plan to talk more about dynamic music in games, how to compose them or use them as mechanics. If you're interested in it, don't hesitate to subscribe. Thank you for watching, see you next time.